Hola, hola. Welcome, everyone. This is Roslyn Hernández, and I am here with...
Giovanny Panginda.
And this is the FYI on youth ministry. This is a podcast that you want to share with your other youth ministry friends and with your senior pastors and anyone else who could really benefit from listening to great stories, research, and ideas about youth ministry.
This season, we're talking all about youth leaders, you, and especially how we can take care of ourselves. But first, here's what youth leaders told us about today's topic.
What is it about uncertainty that makes ministry exhausting?
Yeah, we have found that there are so many voices speaking into what you should do. You've got the CDC, you've got how is your church handling the pandemic? And I'm finding that people are always disappointed in what we are deciding. That part has been really exhausting, just navigating what is right in this situation and really not having a basis for like, okay, well, here's where we're going to start. We're going to start out at square one. Well, there is no square one. There's 29 square ones. And then as soon as you sort of get a rhythm, it changes.
When things are uncertain in these times, like what helps you keep going?
It's holding on to all the times the Lord has been there, showed up in my life again and again and again and again and again.
Our conversation partner today is someone that Gio and I know very well.
It's true.
It is the one, the only, Brad Griffin.
Hey!
Yeah.
Brad is our executive director of content at the Fuller Youth Institute.
It is so fun to be with you all. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, Brad's a youth worker at his church. He's a father of teens. He's the 3 Big Question co-author. He does it all.
Apparently.
Welcome, Brad.
Thank you. I really, really am looking forward to this conversation.
Brad, you had a great conversation a while back with the director of Springtide, his name's Josh Packard, about young people and the state of religion. And just to give a little bit of context, Springtide is a research organization. And I got to tell you, I've seen this interview about 3 times. And every time I see it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so good. Like every 5 minutes, I'm like stopping and like taking that in. It was such a great conversation.
Yeah, I just really appreciate Springtide. They are doing something similar to what we're doing at FYI, but also much broader. And their focus is really tracking with young people across the religious spectrum. And I think that gives us so much valuable data about young people, about faith, about how they're making sense of spirituality and religion. And I just think everybody needs to be paying more attention to what they're saying. So I loved that conversation.
Yeah. Now, if you want to watch the full conversation with Josh Packard, go to our Instagram account in the videos tab. But today, we're actually going to listen to a couple of short clips from that conversation. So let's start with a clip where you talked about a statistic that might make us cringe a bit as youth leaders. So let's dive in and hear what you and Josh said, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
One of the things you say is that all these questions, and the questions of this year in particular, that many of them are from this season are religious in nature, was this phrase that you used, these questions that are religious in nature. What does that mean?
First of all, like 75% of 13 to 25-year-olds identify as religious or spiritual. So it's still an overwhelming majority of young people who say, that they are, that identify in that way in some capacity. Yeah. But even beyond people who take that identification, we find almost across the board interest in what are traditionally, historically, essentially religious questions. What should I do with my life? What happens when I die? How should I live while I'm here? How should I treat other people? Et cetera, et cetera. Maybe for much of the last century, those were questions that were primarily only explored inside of religious spaces, churches, synagogues, et cetera, campus ministries, all that. What we find is that increasingly young people are still very much interested in those questions, but as they've become disconnected from those institutions. They don't always know who to turn to, or even who is an expert in that space of what should I do with my life. Like, people who work in churches are like me. I'm like, come talk to me. I'd love to talk with you. But young people often don't know that because they're not growing up anymore, to the same extent that they used to be inside of those structures.
Yeah. I wonder, so you talk about this, like these spiritual implications of this sort of trifecta of low trust in spiritual or in faith communities or organized religion, just low trust, high isolation.
Yeah.
That young people have been through and are still feeling in many ways. And then this massive uncertainty and how those three things really come together. One statistic that really has stood out to us that we've been quoting, and I've heard Kara Powell, our executive director, quote this a number of times the past month, but that only 10% of the young people in your research said that a faith leader reached out to them at any point during the pandemic personally.
Yeah.
And I think that's tragic. And, any of us who are in these kinds of roles, that's a punch in the gut, that a faith leader wouldn't reach out at all.
I think the way I've been framing it is that, religious leaders are, in some regards, they're professional sense makers. I mean, they help people make sense out of the world. And at a time when young people really needed to help make sense out of the world, the people who are most well suited to do it weren't there. Now, I want to really quickly, I want to make sure that that's like a period, but not even a double space after the period, like just immediate, like it's a run-on sentence, because I don't think it's the failure of individuals. I mean, I think, at Springtide, we're a sociological research institute. It means that we often take this very broad view. And you mentioned that young people are disconnected and distrustful of religious institutions, but that's not because religious institutions have done anything wrong. They're distrustful and disconnected from institutions generally, and that's a trend that's been going on for 50 years. So that it's not, when we look at that number of 10%, yes, it is heartbreaking. But I haven't met a youth director or a pastor or campus minister yet who didn't care enough or wasn't working hard enough. I don't think that number speaks to personal failure as much as what it is indicative of is that we have systems that are built to leverage high institutional trust assumptions. And that number shows the failure of those systems in a low institutional trust environment. We just don't have structures that are built to do relationships en masse. And that's what we needed over the last year. And so I think that's what that 10% number is. It's not individuals, it's systems.
I feel like there's a layer of that too that is about just our own capacity to be effective with all that we were juggling as adults. And,
Absolutely.
I sat with my own volunteer team at church this summer, and we were talking about, we really felt like we failed our students last year. And it wasn't that we weren't trying. We were trying so many things, but it still felt like, it was just hard to do enough or to know the right thing to do, or, what does it mean to reach out to a student? I mean, all of those things that I think just made it hard.
And it's not like,
so I think
the pandemic didn't just happen to young people, it happened to all of us. And I mean, it is a tragic number. It is not anybody's fault. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important distinction to remember there. But it is clearly something that shows like, oh my goodness, like we've got a lot invested in people. If the only way that we can do effective ministry is when people show up here on site on these, Wednesdays and Sundays or something like that, we might need to rethink some things.
Brad, that was such a great conversation. Is there something that you're still thinking about that came from that conversation?
Yeah, Josh said that we are professional sense makers in ministry. And I think a lot about that, about the meaning-making role of youth ministry. But honestly, this season has really defied meaning-making. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I've just had a lot of trouble getting there. We really are trying to help young people and ourselves figure out, what happened? What is happening? Where are we? How do we make not just, personal meaning, but collective meaning and spiritual meaning of all of this with our students when they are just struggling from day to day to survive? Helping them figure out how to thrive. Like, that's great lingo and all, but really, we don't know what we're doing.
That's true.
And I think it's made our task so much more complicated.
The cat's out of the bag. We don't know.
Maybe it's not so much that the cat's out of the bag. It's like we're being vulnerable about it. Or like we're being honest about it. Like, because I think everyone's going through that, right?
Yeah. I love that perspective better.
Something that you both touched on was that there's a low trust in churches or institutions. And we're kind of reframing a lot of things that, as you touched with Josh, there's some things that statistically look really alarming. But once we delve into why is this happening or how long has this been happening, we can see that it's not our fault. He mentioned that in the clip. And it was so liberating and freeing to hear that. And with that, the lack of institutional trust was something that jumped out at me. These are young people and they're coming into their agency and trying to explore things.
We talked about that like trifecta of low trust, isolation, and uncertainty. And I think they're working their way out of, okay, how do I get out of isolation? How do I get out of uncertainty? They're trying to do their own meaning making.
Yeah.
And that really is how they're going to get out of this, how we're all going to get out of this, I think. I think too, you were talking about that line, it's not our fault. and I think about that lack of contact piece, that 10% statistic. Josh emphasized that's not just about individuals, but it's about systems.
Yeah.
And I think too, reflecting on that it's also about perception. Perception defines our reality. And so when a teenager says, no one reached out to me, that may not be objectively true to adults who tried, but it's subjectively true to that teenager.
Sure.
We didn't reach out in the ways they needed. We didn't reach out on the terms they wanted. And I've seen that as true in my own ministry. Students have said, they really haven't felt like people have reached out to them, and they really haven't felt like it, just that this has been a disconnected season. Objectively, I can look at like, oh, well, I texted you 3 times and you didn't text me back. Or, I've talked to 4 adults who I know have reached out to this student. But subjectively to that student, what matters is that they really feel still alone and disconnected. And so if that's still how they're feeling, what we need to get at is solving that perception problem. And sometimes that, I think, is just relentless pursuit, relentless follow-up.
That's why I needed to hear that it's not my fault. Because I tried what I could, and there were times when I did feel shame. And I think I'm not alone. A lot of us are just very passionate about our students, and we want to be there for them. But I needed to hear it's not your fault. And then once I heard that, I could move on and actually be helpful to my student. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah. If you want to know more about today's conversation, check out the show notes page. We have added extra resources to help you dive deeper into this content. And we have a free PDF download with all the highlights from today's show. You can find it at fulleryouthinstitute.org/podcasts.
This episode, the main thing that we want to do is to give youth workers insights into knowing what has happened, to kind of see it objectively. So part of what keeps us going in ministry is knowing that what we're doing is meaningful and that we're making a difference. And like, we want to make a difference in the life of these students. And these past couple of years, it's been really hard to see that difference that we want to make. And some of us might feel like we're failing our students and our churches. And as we see less students join the youth ministry, we might feel like we're failing. So Brad, can you help us understand some of what has been happening in the past couple of years because of the pandemic that has affected youth engagement?
Absolutely. And I hope we can find each other in the midst of this sense of not being alone, that this isn't, if you're feeling this probably isn't you. So on the surface, there's some obvious things. A lot of us have had to change our plans every month.
Yeah.
And we were talking about that. I mean, I remember saying that in a podcast episode a year and a half ago about how tiring it is to have to change our plans every month. And we're still doing that in my ministry. And so students lose track. Honestly, parents stop paying attention. I think that there's so much that kind of gets in the way because of that necessary inconsistency. And then, too, like there's safety concerns, and some students and families feel those more than others because of their own risk factors. We're really not back to full speed in everything we're doing in person. But then there's the stuff under the surface. So that's the surface level. And then under the surface, there's some deeper realities. This constant sense of uncertainty, it's plaguing all of us. It's plaguing our students in really intense ways. And that uncertainty is raising anxiety. It keeps anxiety at, a higher baseline than normal. Just to give an example from my own life and the teenagers in my house, my daughter, who was in season as an athlete, had to test twice a week every week as an athlete, and had one inconclusive test that came back. And so that cut her out, of a game that was really important to her, even though by the time of the game, she had actually had 2 follow-up tests that were negative. Wow. The inconclusive test from 4 days before knocked her out of that game. And so that was a really, that was a disruption that mattered to her. And it was a huge grief and a loss. But like in normal time, that would be sort of okay, that's too bad and I can move on. But given the collective buildup of loss and uncertainty, and this again, for some students, when you add one more thing, it is the one thing that might break them, This contributes to maybe why they're not showing up at youth group too, quite honestly. And it could be around any of that uncertainty. But I also think under the surface, our own self-doubt has increased, and Gio, you talked about this, but I feel that too as a leader. My own self-doubt, like, am I actually any good at this? Are we doing the right things? Do they care? I think those feelings in us as youth workers are probably higher than normal. And there's also, I think, another factor under the surface. Churches are struggling with attendance across the board. People who got out of a rhythm of attending when they really didn't want to attend virtually. And then when ministries started going back in person, it just wasn't a priority anymore. And I think that lack of perceived need and the lack of the perception that we as ministries have something to offer to meet those needs, I think that's a gap that's even stronger than it was. Yeah. And I'll throw one more thing in here that a lot of us, I don't think I'm alone in this, but our relationships within our own ministry teams are thin. We're just not as connected with each other as we used to be. And I think that makes relational ministry a challenge when we're not as relationally connected with the other adults we're doing ministry with.
Yeah, I think that's something I've seen even in social media. People joke about it and say, like, me really wanting social contact again, but haven't had social contact in a long time. So I feel like I'm going to be socially awkward whenever I do get to be with people. So there's like that self-doubt, and I don't remember how to be with people anymore.
Yeah, and it's more tiring for a lot of people. It raises anxiety for people. It raises self-doubt. It raises this sense of, awkwardness and uncomfortable feelings. And quite honestly, we like to avoid uncomfortable feelings. And so if it's going to take a lot of emotional energy and physical energy to show up, then I might just opt out.
Yeah. We actually have a second clip that we want to touch on. It's about the lack of trust that young people feel towards institutions. So let's roll the clip.
One of the statistics that I jotted down from your report was that half of young people say they don't know how to get connected to a faith community, even if they wanted to.
Right.
Coupled with that half don't turn to faith communities due to lack of trust.
That's one of the more mystifying data points, frankly, for me, is like, how do you get connected to a church? Well, I think you just show up. Like, their hours are usually online. You can go there anytime you want. But I also think that that's part of the insight that we need. So in many cases, it seems like what we've got are a bunch of young people saying, I really want to have this conversation with adults who have my best interests in mind. I would love to connect and do that. I'm just not going to cross that physical threshold of your building or of your program or whatever. And you've got a bunch of adults who are inside of those buildings saying, like, I'll do anything for you because I genuinely care about you. I just need you to cross this threshold, And at Springtide, what we really want to do is, help people to see that gap so they can begin to cross it in productive ways. And remember, this is part of a trend. So it's not just that they don't trust institutions. They're being raised by parents who don't trust institutions. And so when they say, like, I don't know how to get in touch with a religious community, that's true. Like,
right.
Things that I think, people in our generation might take as like a duh, this is how you do it. For them is they don't know at all, like the language, the rituals, all of that is new to them, or many of them.
Yeah. Yeah. It brings to mind a conversation I've had not that long ago with a group of youth workers. The one was talking about, she said, in my community, I've got all these like Gen X and older millennial parents of teenagers who, like, maybe they're in our church now, but they don't have a lot of church language. Or if they do, they feel really insecure about sharing some of that language and tradition with their own kids because they've wrestled with the church.
For sure.
Okay, I think one of the most fascinating charts in your report, specifically this Navigating Uncertainty State of Young People in Religion report, is it details what you call the values gap between what young people care about and what they think the church cares about, or they think religious institutions care about. And that resonates with our research as well, that faith leaders are often just we are missing young people sometimes by giving them answers to questions they're not asking. And so tell us more about what you heard there.
What young people are asking questions about and really wanting to know is, like, how is your belief system engaged with LGBTQ plus rights? How is it engaged with Black Lives Matter? What is it doing about gun reform? Or what does it have to say about gun reform or mental health or disability rights? And look, so we'll go just a real quick diversion into the weeds of sociology here, is that because of this disconnect, what is functionally true now for young people is that faith leaders and religious communities are a part of their out group, not their in group. And what happens is that when we see members of the out group, we know sociologically that we paint with a broader brush, we're less forgiving of mistakes, we're less likely to see nuance. And that is where stereotypes come from, right? I mean, this is how like, racial stereotypes are born. This is how all kinds of stereotypes. And so young people are then sitting around saying, like, I care a lot about these issues. Everything that we documented in that chart, I care about all these things. But do I think religious people care about those things? Well, they're in my out group. I think generally painting with this broad brush, no. And so we see a 20-point gap on or more on all of those issues. And so I think once you get to that point, it's no surprise. If you say, like, here's a list of things I care about, and you think, like, here's an organization that doesn't care about those things, of course you're not going to show up to that. Now, while I believe that is objectively the way young people are experiencing religious communities, I don't know, and I think it's important to note here that I'm not sure that it is objectively true. I know a lot of religious people who care about every one of those issues.
Yeah.
But it certainly has very real consequences that young people see it that way.
So as we just heard, Brad, you and Josh talked about the lack of trust many young people feel when it comes to institutions. So we wanted to ask a question that actually came from one of our listeners.
All right.
Yeah. Justin Posley asked on Instagram about where we can learn more about it. So, Brad, can you tell us a bit more about this lack of trust, particularly in churches as religious institutions?
I love that question, Justin and Gio. And so what we know is that trust is the foundation of all relationships. Research tells us over and over just how central trust is to relationships of all kinds. And so that certainly applies to our ministry relationships. So if we have a trust problem in ministry, we have a big problem.
Yeah.
What can we do? So a few thoughts. For most of us, trust builds over time, little by little. For fans of Brene Brown, she talks about adding trust like adding marbles to a jar. And trust is often built in these little exchanges, these little moments of, I see you, I remembered to follow up, I remembered that project that you talked about last week, or I showed up at your play. I mean, it's these little moments. So consistency in youth ministry is key. And for a lot of us who've been doing this for a while, that's nothing new. But I think we need that reminder more than ever now about how consistency helps build trust. So, my first thought for all of us is show up anyway. Reach out anyway. That kid has been ignoring you or ghosted you or, whatever it is, like the consistency over time can lead to a breakthrough. And so I actually have a story about this too, where a student comes to mind who for no joke, for 7 years, little by little, just tried to keep reminding this student that I cared. And I got nothing for 7 years. And one morning, we went on a hike together at Griffith Park, and like in that one conversation, suddenly things opened up.
Wow.
And suddenly we had a conversation that we had not had before. And it seriously took 7 years to get there. It was that little, like, trying again, showing up anyway, asking questions, getting nothing in response. And I mean, we all know kids like that, right? And some students, like, they like to hotwire connection real fast.
Yep.
And
Sure.
they're going to spill it all right away, and they're going to, like, tell us everything about their life.
Uh-huh.
And then there's those other students that are, they're 7-year students. So on that note too, so trust can be built little by little, or is usually built little by little, and trust is often usually broken little by little. Of course, there are big blow-ups that build trust, but there's these little moments where we lose trust in each other. And so as leaders, being ready to give apologies, when we mess up, being ready to seek repair is really, really important, because we can rebuild trust. We can, but we got to work at it, which might be saying, hey, I'm really sorry. I was hoping to make it to your game and I didn't, and I hope I can make it next time. Or the way I responded to you, or I think I shut you down in that conversation. I'm sorry about that. I want to do that different next time. Just, it's little things.
Those are such great examples of, and like practical ways that we can build trust with our students and in our ministry. One of the other things that you talked about was also when the church or adults are giving them answers to questions that they aren't asking, or we're just not engaging the issues that they care about. What can we do?
I love that Springtide takes that sociological approach, and Josh used that word outgroup, that faith leaders are an outgroup to young people. And part of what that means is, we've got to work extra hard because the assumption, we make assumptions about people who are in our outgroup, right?
Yes.
I heard a sermon just recently from a friend who, he said, I'm so tired of saying in conversations, I'm a Christian, but... and having to complete it with basically not that kind of Christian, right?
Yep.
Oh no, yeah.
And what was so interesting is that resonated with the teenagers who heard that, because they kind of feel themselves in that same position. I think the more that we can help teenagers see that values gap, like close that values gap. So maybe at your particular church you can't take a stand on an issue, but how can you stay in a conversation with young people? Or maybe you're at a church where you can. And I love thinking about how could we take action together. Our colleague and a podcast host here, Jennifer Geraldana, talks about praying with our feet. That in joining students in protest and activism and at vigils, when there's violence in the community or when there's a particular issue that, that emerges, to pray with our feet together and go with students Like there are students in my church who we've been to numerous gatherings together, where we gather with large groups of people around particular things that happen or particular issues that we're speaking out about. Sometimes those are faith-based gatherings, they're prayer vigils. Sometimes they're not. But I think that is one way that we can affirm with students, like, hey, this is something we care about. And this is something that matters to our faith. What's going on in the world. Those are important faith conversations.
Or I understand that this is important for you, and that's why I'm here supporting what you care about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that turns into looking like a really practical way of loving our neighbors. And that's how students, I hope that's how students will see it.
So we are ending every episode this season with very practical ideas around practices that help us care for ourselves, especially as leaders, so that we can serve in youth ministry for the long haul. Now, many youth leaders don't have that relational bandwidth that they had before. I know I don't, but we all still need to feel these relational bonds. So since today we talked a little bit about the relational aspects, especially things like isolation and trust, let's each share a practice that helps us meet either our personal relational needs or a practice that can actually help us build trust with our students. So Brad, since you are our awesome, amazing guest, how about you go first?
What comes to mind for me is, as a leader, it's really important that you learn to name your own feelings and that you learn to name where you can name your own feelings.
Yeah.
So I have really had to grow in understanding how to name what I'm feeling. And some of that comes from my own just journey of figuring out how to name my emotions. But it's so important as a leader in the church. There are places I can name what I'm really feeling and places that I can't, places that are not safe to name what I'm really feeling. And sometimes that might actually be talking with, your supervisor or your pastor and saying, okay, I got a lot I need to work through here. Who can I talk to? Like, can you be that safe person for me? Or do we need to identify somebody else? Because I can't just throw this anywhere.
Yeah.
And if you don't know who that is, in your context, to find out who that is, where you can actually share the things that you need to process, because you need that. You need that safe place. If you don't know, you need to figure out where that is.
And how about you, Roslyn?
Yeah, I'm going to do like Brad and quote Brene Brown again.
Always a safe bet.
And something that she says is clarity is kindness. Especially being an introvert, I need to be clear about my boundaries. And I think also being clear with others about expectations is really important. And this doesn't have to be like a relationship contract or anything like that, but saying something like, hey, this week is going to be really busy for me. Just communicating expectations and boundaries and leaning into kindness in our relationships.
That's good.
That's great. I too will be the third person to use Brene Brown. And it is, trust is braving connections. And the way my students and I connect is we love questions. We're always asking questions. We have this thing called Question of the Week. I love it. They love it because questions, I think, is what allows permission for people to be vulnerable when they want to be ready to be vulnerable. Questions is what connects us. The questions and the answers. So.
Well, thank you, Brad, for revisiting this conversation. We've had such a great time learning and getting some insight into what's going on, even as we feel like we don't know what's going on.
That's right. Oh, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, Josh Packard, for your interview with Brad and allowing us to be able to revisit this again. You can find that on Instagram for the full video, and we'll link it to our show notes. We'll link Springtide to our show notes. Also, thank you, Justin, for your question. Great question. Please ask us more questions. Again, we love questions. So comment on any social media that we have and with your question. And thank you, listeners.
Thank you. Till next time.
Farewell. For more great content, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where you can see more Instagram lives. Like what you're hearing? Then leave us a review and share this podcast with your friends. Help us reach more leaders like you. Thanks to Brad and Roslyn for that honest conversation. And a special thanks to the youth leaders, Kathy and Maddie. And now, here is one more clip from a youth leader.
When things are uncertain in these times, like what helps you keep going?
Seeing that God doesn't move because of my program. God moves because God moves. So when I talk to students, they are struggling, but it's often in our struggles that God meets us the most or the best. And so to hear students starting to connect those dots is beautiful. To hear students say, I was relying on the program to keep me close to God or to help me think that I was close to God. When the program was taken away and we went online, I had to start reading scripture for myself. I had to start actually praying for myself. I realized that I really missed the God piece. And I had to learn how to start feeding myself. Now, we had programs and online, we had all the online stuff, and we had all the check-ins, and we had all the Zoom meetings. But students, by and large, were left to be in their head a little bit. And they had to start reaching out to God and figuring that out. And what they found was that they can develop a relationship with God that is just so sweet and specific to them. We youth leaders care so much. And so we just try to be everything for all people. And we can't do that. And to remember that God's Spirit is moving. He's moving in students' lives and he's drawing them to himself. It's just beautiful.